Today's talk is going to be delivered by the Professor Jonathan Whitmer. Jonathan Whitmer is an associate professor of chemical and biomolecular engineering at the University of Notre Dame in US. He holds the bachelor degrees in math and in physics from the Kansas State University, and the master and the PhD degrees in physics from the University of Illinois. He later joined to the Argonne National Laboratory as a postdoc in the DiPablo group at the University of Wisconsin. And he received the NSF Career Award in 2018, and his group develops the open source software called SAGES, that stands for Software Suite for Advanced General Ensemble Simulations, in collaboration with the Argonne National Laboratory and the Department of State Computational Materials Science Center located at this lab. Among his areas of interest, we find the equilibrium and non-equilibrium polyelectrolytes, liquid crystal gels, elastomers, and sensors, colloidal clustering, and self-assembly. So thank you, John, for being here and for accepting the invitation to give this talk. Welcome.
Gracias, Adrián, por la invitación. Gracias por la introducción. Tengo un par de comentarios preparados. Gracias por recibirme aquí en el aniversario del instituto. Tengo una buena relación con muchos de los profesores aquí, a quienes considero amigos y colaboradores. Hablaré de nuestro trabajo en física y estadística computacional con Machine Learning. El resto de mi presentación, debido a mi limitado español, será en inglés. Doy la bienvenida a sus preguntas. Okay. If I remember how to work a computer. So this is my group. As Adrián said, I am a professor of chemical engineering at the University of Notre Dame, but I'm a physicist at heart, and by upbringing, all of my degrees are in physics. I think like a physicist, and it actually helps me be a better engineer. This is the people who have done the work, the funding agencies who have funded the work, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge them. And I always do this at the beginning so that if I run out of time, I do not forget. In particular, for this work, I would like to acknowledge my first graduate student, Hytham Sidki, who did a lot of the things I will present today, along with graduate students Jala Shi, Michael Quavillion, and Pedro Amarim, who contributed other things to this talk. Others are acknowledged as well, but they were the main players in this work. I have a lot of good collaborators to thank too, in particular Juan de Pablo, who's at University of Chicago. And I wanted to acknowledge I've recently had a paper and a burgeoning collaboration with Pedro Ramirez, who is in the Faculty of Physics at San Luis Potosi, and it's bearing some very interesting fruit. And I hope next time I have a chance to speak with you, I can present on that work. So what we do in my group is we study soft materials, and we do that with computer simulations. And so that involves a few different modeling choices. Some things that we do are done so that we can have better sampling, better statistical representations of the physics of a system. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about predominantly today. And then some of the things are using those tools to elucidate the interactions in a system. We've explored self-assembly and host-guest interactions in chemistry. We have looked at understanding the behavior of liquid crystalline phases. And let me put this pointer up here. Understanding the behavior of liquid crystalline phases. We look at colloidal clustering. We look at the behavior of ions transporting through porous media. And we look at polyelectrolytes. So all of those things that Adrián mentioned in the introduction, we do. It may seem like we do a lot of things that are loosely related, but I contend, and this is because I am a physicist, that they are very related. They are very much founded in the principles of thermodynamics, statistical mechanics, and modeling in physics. and molecular simulations that enable us to say things about a lot of different systems. Okay. So it's essential to understand what comes next, to understand the principle of advanced sampling and what it is. When you do a molecular simulation, often you will be stuck in a metastable state. If this half pipe here, or half pipe of sorts, represents a potential energy surface, we know that the marble would like to get to the lowest point, but it won't always get there in the course of a simulation. Sometimes it will be at a higher point, and we want to be able to kick it so that it gets down and samples this area as well. That will enable us to get more information about the equilibrium. But also, sometimes we're in the equilibrium and we want to know what's near equilibrium, but not necessarily in it. This requires us to do advanced sampling, which requires us to do some numerical statistical mechanics. Molecular simulations work by attempting to understand the partition function. There are two essential ways in which we do it. We can do it via Monte Carlo or molecular dynamics, and each of these is typically constructed only to get averages over the partition function for reasons that I will outline here. We note that the state vector, or a system point of any system in a constant volume ensemble, is defined by this vector, and it is completely determined by the Newton equations for all other times past and future through the classical equations of motion. Okay? You can get an ergodic trajectory in molecular dynamics that will evolve to each meaningful microstate commensurate with the ensemble chosen. Typically, we're not interested in these individual configurations. We're interested in collective properties. I'm going to normally label these as Xi, the Greek letter Xi. I borrow this from the literature. I also kind of like it. It's a nice squiggly letter. But we're interested in these that describe the system. They could be some kind of structural order parameter, some kind of reaction coordinate denoting an extent of transformation, some kind of collective variable that labels similar states. In the case of liquid crystalline materials, it might be the orientational order parameter, but it could also be something as simple as the energy, the enthalpy, okay, some kind of thermodynamic variable. These are typically measured via histograms or time averages over the system state. We need the partition function in these in order to create the divisor. If we're wanting to sample these things directly, it would be helpful if we actually knew with what probability each individual type of state could occur. But that evaluation is effectively impossible. I have here at the right a classic textbook. Well, maybe it's not that classic. It's only 20 years old now. That dates me more than it dates the book. But it is an important book for early people learning molecular simulation. And what it says in this book is about quantum systems, but it also applies to classical systems, which we're typically going to investigate here. And it is that the number of quantum states contributing to the average, therefore in the partition function, is so astronomically large that a numerical evaluation of all the expectation values is unfeasible. If we'd like to know the partition function, that's a great ideal, but we're probably not going to get there. We can do somewhat better. We can do somewhat better by labeling states by small numbers of collective variables that enable us a partial evaluation of the partition function. It's not an evaluation in the sense we will get to every state. It's an evaluation in the sense we will get to each state with its relative probability as it is labeled according to this collective variable Xi. When you do that, you're able to extract a free energy along this collective variable Xi, and therefore extract any material property that you would like, any measure of the thermodynamics of the system through this. So do we get some progress through state labeling? I would contend that we do. In a trajectory that's done through molecular dynamics, where we solve Newton's equations for the atoms in a system, or a Markov chain Monte Carlo, where we evolve it according to statistical means, we initially have a sequence of observed microstates. We turn that by labeling them according to a collective variable into a sequence of observed macrostates, and we can histogram that and obtain effective free energies in this way. Okay. In arbitrary coordinates, it can actually be easier to get the free energies than this lets on. And one way in which we can do that is to use an algorithm known as metadynamics or metadynamics derived things. These work in the following way. We develop on the fly biases that are applied to the underlying free energy landscape of a system that enable us to extract the overall free energy from it. We use this equation here, which basically says the free energy is going to be some, well, it's going to be the negative log of the probability. And we add some biasing energy to it such that that effective free energy is 0. That allows us to read off the free energy of the system. It works in the following way. We start in a particular location. As the particle rattles around, we add a Gaussian to the system that we sum up until it becomes flat. When it becomes flat, which it will do here in just a second, it's close enough there. When it becomes flat, it will be able to put it there. When it becomes flat, we will be able to take the negative of what we've added and approximate the free energy of the system. It's an incredibly useful and fairly general technique. Now, metadynamics, as I alluded to, is not the only option for doing this. There are other ways to gather similar statistics and gather similar biases, and these include variationally enhanced sampling, which proposes some variational weights that can be adapted on the fly. There is adaptive biasing force, which works by countering the mean force instead of the statistics of sampling. There's temperature accelerated molecular dynamics, which works by effectively sampling collective variables at a higher temperature than the individual coordinates. And there are a few other methods. One of them is one I developed during my time as a postdoc, and it involves using basis functions to approximate the partition function at different stages in the process to create a running estimate and obtain the updated biases. When we project them onto basis functions, that enables us a simple representation of the free energy of the system. There's video here. So you can see that I start here in this region, which is labeled by the red curve. And as the bias evolves, it starts to push me out into new regions where I'm starting in this green basin. I will spill over into the other green basin, and eventually this will come together. My estimate of the free energy will converge to the actual free energy. My bias projection, or the negative of it, will converge also to the free energy. And I will have a very flat purple curve in here, which is the difference between those estimate and actual free energies. We can use this to be able to extract material properties very specifically. And in particular, we have applied this to using or to calculating the elastic coefficients of liquid crystals. If we think of free energy as an expansion in deformations, okay, and our collective variable psi is some deformation of the system, we can develop a mapping from the polynomial describing these deformations or describing the energy of these deformations to the Legendre polynomials, the orthogonal functions that represent our basis set. And we can use this for things like a pneumatic liquid crystal elastic free energy. And we did this in a physical review letters manuscript that we submitted now 3 years ago. Doesn't seem like that long, but I guess it was, where we were able to extract elastic constants for this system from a numerical model. And the numerical model was parameterized only to represent the thermodynamics of the system. It was trying to get the transition temperatures for the cyanobiphenol elastic, or the cyanobiphenol pneumatic materials correct by matching the transition temperature from that to the transition temperature experiment via this T minus TNI, and then simulating using basis function sampling, we're able to get elastic coefficients which intercalate between the top and bottom bounds of experimental values. So we're able to get things from this that are quite complex and yet very accurate. using molecular simulation models. Now, there are some limitations. Using a given functional form, this includes the Gaussians of metadynamics as much as it includes the Legendre polynomials or Fourier series that occur in basis sets. Okay, these don't necessarily efficiently represent all free energy landscapes. If they're smooth enough, it works great. If they're less smooth, you can suffer from some oscillations, either near boundaries or near sharp features. And choosing the parameters which determine how many functions you will use in this can heavily influence the speed and accuracy of the estimated free energy. So my grad student, Hytham Sidki, came to me one day and said, I really like this paper you did, this PRL. It's very nice. I really like this paper. I think you could do it better. You could do it better by using an artificial neural network. And we use an artificial neural network not in a decision-making sense, but in the sense that you can use neural networks as efficient function approximators. They can be used to approximate a function in 1 dimension, in 2 dimensions, in 3 dimensions. A lot of this happens to depend only on the architecture of the neural network and the number of neurons you put in the neural network. Those are really the only limitations to how much information you can represent. And so we do this in the following way. A neuron in an artificial neural network takes some input. It sums it together with some weight to create output. There could be a bias activation on there, and it includes some function that will be propagated to the next layer. Typically what we use a linear function at the end and a sigmoidal for the approximation functions. And we use a fully connected multi-layer neural network. Now, typically, if we're looking at a one-dimensional system, we have only one hidden layer, but the more dimensions we have, the more there is a need for hidden layers to resolve the multidimensional features that arise in those free energy landscapes. Okay? It works in principle exactly the same as the basis function method. It's just free of basis functions. We have the artificial neural network providing the function approximate that gives us an estimate of the free energy. We follow a very similar pathway where we collect a histogram, construct an unbiased estimate, turn it into an estimate of the free energy, train the neural network to learn the bias potential, and then carry on. The method parameters that are left here are the sweep interval, the architecture, the objective function, the optimization algorithm. But with proper choices of the optimization algorithm, which we tend to use Levenberg-Marquardt, and the objective function, where we use an error estimate with a regularization feature so that none of the weights get too high, we're able to get a scheme that's largely insensitive to the other parameters. It can affect the time to convergence, but not the degree to which the system will converge. So as an illustration here, have a video. It plays a little bit faster than the previous one, but we are going over this complex one-dimensional energy landscape and sampling it with the ANN method. And the important thing is that after only about 60 sweeps, none of which are large enough to cover the entire area of the system, we have essentially all of the features acquired within the system. Comparing this to a 200-degree Legendre polynomial, we see that there's a lot of ringing in that energy landscape, whereas for the neural networks, there is a very small degree of deviation from the underlying energy landscape, primarily around sharp features which have either not been sampled or cannot easily be resolved with a network of this degree. We also note there are 50 Gaussians in this surface. If we use a neural network with 50 nodes in one hidden layer, we're able to almost identically represent that free energy landscape. And a limitation in this can be the complexity of the free energy landscape. We're able to get most of the information. With only 50 hidden neurons in the layer, we don't gain much by adding more features to that and by adding more pieces to the function evaluation. Okay. As a second example, we look at the fruit fly of advanced sampling research, which is the alanine dipeptide. I believe that starts with click, so there it goes. And this is one which you can characterize through the torsion angles phi and psi. Okay, and this is run for the alanine dipeptide in water. We compare the ANN method to the robust but significantly slower, as can be seen, adaptive biasing force method. And we note that while we're getting some fluctuations in the surface, this essentially has converged by the time around 1 nanosecond has gone by, whereas this takes significantly longer and is still adapting up to around 100 nanoseconds of time. Okay. Some improvements can be made to this. So we get a lot of good improvement, a lot of good behavior from this neural network representation of the free energy landscape. But as I said, the force-based method, the adaptive biasing force, can be looked at as more robust. You can train a network instead of on counts, instead of on visitations to different states and on a histogram like we have done, train it instead on your estimated weight from this force-based method. It marries the benefits, the robustness of ABF with the interpolation power and speed of the neural network method. And it also works quite well. This one I'm not going to be able to start at the same time, but we can show that starting from an initial estimate, and the initial estimate looks actually quite wild, we can propagate forward and notice that it converges to the anticipated free energy landscape very quickly, whereas ABF, the adaptive biasing force method, takes significantly longer. We'll pause it there so you can see the surface. And even at the end of this has significant distortion of features. This can be quantified in terms of the root mean squared error, so RMSE here, that shows that the FUN method, or force biasing using neural networks, which has later been renamed to the FUN ABF method, is able to converge to a good estimate of the energy landscape, the long time energy landscape, within 2 nanoseconds, whereas it takes a very slow drift to get the ABF simulation to converge. Okay. We can use these speed improvements to not only sample classical molecular dynamics simulations, but also get free energies from ab initio simulations. And we do this in collaboration with several researchers at the University of Chicago and Argonne National Lab, in particular, Julia Galli and Francois Gigi, in addition to myself and Juan de Pablo. And what we've been able to show is that you can take even complex systems, relatively complex systems, such as this alanine dipeptide, you can get an initial estimate of the free energy from a classical implementation in terms of fixed charge and molecular structure and standard classical force field elements. We can then implement this as a baseline to bias the system in a quantum mechanical ab initio molecular dynamics simulation using functionals of increasing accuracy and higher order. And this enables us to get a free energy landscape in a tractable amount of time. Even though we need a lot of sampling, most of the features are common in between these systems. We fill in the differences, and that allows us to maximize the amount of time we spend sampling this surface. We note that while the surfaces are similar, there are some very distinct features, most notably the lack of these barriers that occur in the classical simulation due to force field fits and the limitations of the force field form. And we note that the transition pathways also are similar and yet still a little distinct as this molecule is evolved. Okay. We've used this technique to look at the evolution of other types of systems, and in a recently submitted article, which can be found on arXiv, I should update this slide, you can see how we have used free energy sampling techniques coupled to ab initio simulation in order to estimate the free energy, actually accurately calculate the free energy of these clusters and understand when different transitions will occur based on temperature and based on other influences in the system. Now we have visions for the future, and One of those is to take the best of both worlds. I noted that we can get a lot of good information out of both the neural network and the adaptive fun algorithm. And we can take the best of both worlds. If we simultaneously train two networks in order to explore the surface, we can get part of the estimate from the counts that are received, part of the estimate from the forces that are felt, and we combine them into what we call the combined force frequency, or CFF method. And this converges even faster than the force-based method, to the point where our biggest limitation now is sampling itself. We cannot get around the free energy landscape fast enough to keep up with how aggressively this would like to converge. Now, there are a couple of issues and limitations with this ANN-based sampling, and it's that sometimes it's too aggressive. It's very good at interpolation and extrapolation of the free energy landscape from a minimal amount of data, but it can occasionally, such as in this case of a simulation run by my graduate student Ace Leonard, it can show that instead of running it through the configurations that are expected and that are physically feasible for the system, it can attempt to push molecules through each other in an unphysical way. The remaining challenges, though, are not ones of sampling, not ones of getting the most information out of the least sampling, but ones of improving your sampling so you can make the most of the algorithm, jumping around the surface and finding alternative ways to drive exploration. One way in which we have chosen to do this is to look at methods such as the parallel biasing method that enable the examination of multiple collective variables simultaneously, but essentially look at convergence or look at the behavior of the collective variable along one structural important degree of freedom. That's where we want to resolve the free energy. The others are used to drive the system around, and by judicious choice of these, combination of a structural and a dynamic variable, we can improve both the exploration and the time to convergence in terms of the simulation. Now, the next frontier for us, as far as this goes, is to start exploring non-equilibrium systems. You heard that Adrian mentioned we are interested in non-equilibrium things, and I'll give a little bit of a preview of something that is coming soon, where we are trying to extract free energy landscapes or effective free energy landscapes in systems that are not at equilibrium. Right now, we're testing it using systems that are at equilibrium. And the idea is very similar to the construction of Markov state models, but slightly distinct. We populate a transition matrix, in this case, using short molecular dynamics runs. Effectively, we solve the master equation for the steady state probability distribution obtained from the null space of that matrix. And we use that probability distribution to understand what the steady state is. It's actually quite successful at representing equilibrium systems with a minimal amount of data. And we also have recently shown, although I don't have the slides here, that you can use it to understand systems that have temperature gradients in them, and that it is able to resolve these probabilities very efficiently there. Okay. I don't want to speak too fast, but in the time I have left, I want to show how we have applied some of the concepts of machine learning and some of the concepts of free energy to understanding polymer surface interactions. Okay, so this is work that has been done by my graduate student, Jala Shi, and there are a lot of different applications where a polymer surface interaction is important. Ink on paper, entry of viruses into cells, how cells grip onto things, coatings for chip manufacturing. Those are all potential applications. And there have been recent studies in how you can design different polymer sequences for function. Our question was, what can we do to design an adhesive? We have a situation, okay, us and our collaborators, where we would like to take a surface of known composition and design a polymer that will stick onto it. And so my student Jala and I set about thinking about how we could design a simple model and then design a machine learning method that can extract the properties of this and could be optimized over for maximum adhesion. And this is what we've described here. So the model polymer is a crane-regressed bead spring chain. We use a fixed surface. We use two types of interaction. They're adhesive to themselves. They are marginally repulsive relative to each other. A little bit weaker interaction, but it's a purely repulsive interaction. And the rest of the model is based solely on the classic crane-regressed bead spring chain. We use the adaptive biasing force algorithm to extract the adhesive free energy, which is represented here as the difference between the separated or this plateau distance and the minimum, which is set in this graph to 0. And we extract that for each of the polymer sequences in a given database. There's a lot of sequences. We couldn't possibly simulate the free energy for all of them. That's on the order of 1 million for even this relatively simple system. So instead, we pick a subset of about 20,000, and we use those calculated against the surface patterns at the right in order to try and understand how these systems will behave. Now, there's some interesting features in the data. You'll note for the more regular surfaces, we have really multimodal distributions, but for the more randomized or the more uniform looking surfaces, we tend to have a unimodal peak, sometimes even bordering on a Gaussian shape for the curves, and that there are symmetries in some of the simulated behaviors for some of these cases, but the ones which are allowed to be more random and more asymmetric have, kind of a distribution which doesn't necessarily clearly correlate with just the fraction of A-type beads alone. So we use a support vector regression model, and that support vector regression model is then used to train on the computed adhesion potentials, and we can then use that in a subsequent optimization as a surrogate model in order to extract the best adhesive polymers. Okay? So this is some representative performance for our support vector regression model. We compute the free energies. Okay, we train it on a subset of this, and the subset of this, I believe for this case, was 8,000 of the 20,000 sequences. And we then use that to predict the rest of the remaining data, and we'll see that there's a very narrow distribution. We get a very, very good representation of the training set, as is to be expected, but even the test set, all of the different sequences are predicted to within primarily a KT of each other, which is quite a good agreement between the surrogate model and the real system. This performance is strongly reliant on the amount of training you do, and the number of polymers in the training set has to be a huge, well, not huge, but a reasonably good fraction of this in order to get a good R-squared or a good statistical agreement between the surrogate model and the real systems. And we see that most of the information comes through by the time we've selected only about 1/5 of the data. We're able to get great representation on that, even if we only have about 4,000 sequences. And that's something that's uniform across the different surfaces we tested. So we see that polymer sequence plays an important role. We can use surface patterns to affect this range and distribution, and we can inexpensively capture it with a delta F that can be used then to do targeted sequence design. With that, I would like to wrap up. I could continue talking for quite a while, but I have made the essential points I would like to make. And I would like to acknowledge not only the students that did the work and the funding agencies that made the work possible, but I would like to thank all of you. Gracias por la invitación. I would like your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. This was really an amazing talk. So we have time for questions. I don't know if people from the audience here in the Zoom would like to ask questions. Yeah, Magdalena, please.
Hola, Magdalena.
Sorry, now I have my microphone on. Sorry, just to say that I enjoyed the talk a lot, And I would also like to ask you, with respect to the attempts to model non-equilibrium systems, by writing the master equation, that's the approach that apparently you use. Is it possible, let's say, that this master equation will lead to solutions, not only the ones that take you to equilibrium, but others that will take you to other solutions, other stationary solutions, which are not equilibrium ones?
That is the hope, actually. We have seen in some of the studies we've done so far, okay, that you can get multiple zeros in that master equation. And the multiple zeros represent potentially the effectively ergodic trajectory of the system, which is the equilibrium trajectory if the system is in equilibrium, but also quasi-ergodic trajectories in the system, right? Paths that are limited, that are shut off from the rest of the sampling. And we have seen in some cases that you can get multiple solutions where the steady state in one case migrates toward one, depending on what the initial conditions are, and the steady state in another case migrates toward the other. You can get into any of the states that are designed by the null space, that are designated by the null space, but you will select one or the other distributions based on where your initial conditions were. So we have seen that in a limited sense, but this is the hope. The genesis of this was that we want to describe, and we're not there yet, I will admit we're not there yet, we want to describe situations which have absorbing states, which have patently non-equilibrium ending. And in order to do that, we need a way to characterize the equation, the most general of which is to characterize the transitions that lead to some subset steady state. And so that's why we've constructed it the way we have.
Good. Yeah, probably my question comes from the fact that going from a different direction to the same problem of describing non-equilibrium with the self-consistent theory that we have developed in San Luis Potosí, that has this very nice feature that tells you, look at the stationary solutions.
Right.
And one of them, the queen of them, is the equilibrium solution.
Right.
But then there are others that clearly are attached to dynamic arrest, which is not only is not thermodynamic, but also kinetic, let's say, the reason for the stationarity. And I'm sure that scenario will be found in other schemes like the one that you're using.
Yes.
So anyway, that's a good reason.
It's a great question, and I would love to talk to you solely about this for hours.
Absolutely.
And
that's why I wrote, because we should find additional spaces to talk about this.
Sure, absolutely.
Anyway,
absolutely.
Just to say, I really enjoyed your talk and hope to talk to you later.
I do. Thank you, Magdalena. Gracias.
Gracias a ti.
Are there any other questions? Yeah, John, I have a question that regarding is like, how do you figure out how is the landscape of the free energy? And for example, if you have like, if you are approaching to the critical point, for example, a given critical point, then in this method, do you observe something that this like scaling behavior of the some let's say these response equations and functions like the heat capacities, compressibilities. Do you observe that scaling behavior somehow in this method that you develop?
So if you were to examine those situations using these methods, what you would have to do would be to construct a collective variable that captures the essential features. If you're looking at an icing model, that's what comes to mind whenever someone says critical points and scaling, because I'm a physicist. I think first of the icing model. And you can use this to study the icing model. And you can use this to study the free energy landscape that will effectively be sort of like the Landau free energy, the estimated free energy that you get in an icing model situation. So like the phi to the fourth Landau model, but you will get the full statistics instead of approximating it like Landau does in terms of this this polynomial approximation, you know, with some very good, very elegant hand waving. You get the full free energy landscape. You will see that it's a symmetric solution. You will see the development of the two different basins for the positive and negative magnetizations in the icing model. And you can then use the magnetization that comes out at finite temperature to extract the scaling. You don't get the scaling for free. You will have to do a few different simulations at a few different temperatures. What you do get that you don't get in other cases is an enhanced ability to reweigh the simulations and reuse data near the critical point, because you have captured, if you do this correctly, the configurations as a function of the magnetization, which is a great collective variable, and the energy, which is a great collective variable. And from those, you should be able to extract any of the scaling relations that you would like for liquid type systems, for icing type systems, for more adventurous systems that I cannot come up with right now, but perhaps you were thinking about, since I see you smiling and nodding. So I'm sure you have something in mind. But yes, you can get some of these features. And I know that you've done a lot of work with Landau Q-tensor models. And Abelardo, I know you've done a lot of work with Abelardo Ramirez, who's also going to give a talk today, has done a lot of work with Flory-Huggins type models. And even in a purely theoretical sense, if you can represent these things spatially on a lattice and explore the free energies associated with it, these methods have analogs that can be used there to understand the genesis of certain features and their probabilities and what you can expect. So I primarily use them for molecular simulations, and I primarily use them well away from critical points. So I can't give you the exact recipes, but I know they could be used.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we have a question from Enrique Diaz.
Yes, hello. Maybe my question related with the commentary of Magdaleno.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, the method is strongly dependent of the sampling of the trajectory of the simulation.
Yes.
If these trajectory are not in equilibrium,
mm-hmm.
then the free energy that you
mm-hmm.
calculate is only an stationary state in the simulation.
Yes.
That's all. One need to implement or use other tools in order to are sure that you are in equilibrium in your simulation. Is this true?
So that's a good point. So if you're not in equilibrium, for certain, you cannot be sure that what you are extracting is the true free energy. It is not. It is not an equilibrium free energy. It is an effective free energy that pertains to the non-equilibrium state that you happen to be in. You could be wanting to do this. That's what we're working toward with this method that approximates the master equation. But in most cases that I presented today, you want to proceed from equilibrium. You want to make sure you are at equilibrium and sampling there. Now, there's a big caveat. If you dive into these methods, they are, by virtue of adding on-the-fly biasing forces, continually pumping energy into a system. You need to make sure that whatever rate they add that energy with is small, so that a system that starts in equilibrium effectively stays in equilibrium with only the adjusted potential being a record that they have ever gone away from the initial state, right? In any way that's different from a standard equilibrium simulation. So you have to make sure you prepare the initial system in equilibrium, or it could be in a metastable state that's at least locally thermodynamically in equilibrium. And then you apply these biases aggressively yet gently, if that makes sense. Aggressively yet gently, aggressively enough that you can approach an estimate of the free energy quickly, but gently enough that you are not driving yourself away from equilibrium. That's a caveat. That's a big if in cases, in some cases, a very big if, that needs to be satisfied to get the equilibrium free energies from the first 2/3 of the talk. When we're talking then about a situation where we're trying to extract whatever the steady state is, regardless of whether it's equilibrium or not, then the difficulty comes with preparing the initial conditions in a way which is commensurate with the right steady state. That's actually a pretty big challenge. It's one we've circumvented. Don't have a ton of time to talk about it, but it's one which we're excited about the capabilities of, and we're excited about the abilities to build it forward into something that can characterize any of the zero eigenmodes of the master equation, anything in the null space, any of the meaningful absorbing states of that equation.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It was great. I really love talking about this stuff. Maybe you can tell.
Thank you. Nice talk, actually. Sorry. At the end.
Gracias.
Gracias, Enrique. Thank you, John. So we don't have more time for questions, and we have to move to the Abelardo talks. He is in a different channel.
Okay,
So
I will stop the.
All right. Thank you, John. So I can send you a virtual aplauso. So I appreciate that you accept the invitation for this talk, and I will be happy to hear you again in the near future.
And I will be glad to come to San Luis the next available opportunity. I love the city. My family loves the city, so we will be there again.
That's great. You're always welcome.